One night, deep in the Egyptian desert, a government official led a woman into a 3,000-year-old temple in total darkness. No map, no lights, just a single torch he kept for himself. His plan was simple. He would name a room, any room, somewhere inside the massive stone complex, and she would have to take him there. He was certain she would fail, because this woman had never set foot in the temple before in her life. She claimed she didn't need a map. She claimed she remembered the building, not from photographs, not from books, from living inside it 3,000 years ago. She took him to the first room without hesitating, then the second, then the third. She walked through pitch-black corridors like she was walking through her own house, turning before the turns came, stopping exactly where doorways opened. He named a fourth location. She found it. A fifth, a sixth. 6 attempts to catch her in the dark, and 6 times she led him straight to the spot. At that point, nothing about the temple's interior layout had even been published. There was nothing to memorize, nothing to study. And the man giving the test wasn't some gullible tourist. He was the chief inspector of Egypt's own Department of Antiquities, the person whose entire job was protecting these monuments from frauds. But here's what makes this story genuinely disturbing. Her knowledge of that temple didn't come from dreams alone. It came from something physical. 70 handwritten pages of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, scribbled in the middle of the night by a teenage girl in London, decades earlier, in a trance, in handwriting that wasn't hers. Pages that told the story of who she used to be. A name, a temple, a forbidden affair with a pharaoh, and a death she chose for herself. And when scientists finally tested the claims buried in her memories, when they put radar and shovels against her words, the ground gave up secrets that had been hidden for thousands of years. A lost garden, a hidden tunnel, and a sealed chamber that archaeology wouldn't confirm until 2015, more than 3 decades after she died. This is the story of the woman Egyptologists still call the most convincing case of reincarnation ever documented. And to understand how she knew too much, you have to go back to the day she died the first time. In this life. London, 1907. A 3-year-old girl named Dorothy Eady was playing at home when she fell down a full flight of stairs. She hit her head and was knocked unconscious. When her parents found her at the bottom, she wasn't breathing. They called a doctor, who rushed to the house, examined the little girl, and delivered the sentence, "No parent survives hearing." There was nothing he could do. Dorothy was dead. Her mother broke down, the doctor left, and about an hour later he returned carrying Dorothy's death certificate and began gently discussing arrangements for the body. And that's when they heard it. Shuffling, coming from Dorothy's room. They ran upstairs, and there she was, playing on the floor like nothing had happened. The doctor examined her again and found no sign of injury, no explanation. He said it appeared as if Dorothy had come back from the dead. After the fall, everything changed. Dorothy started having night terrors. Her mother would wake her, and Dorothy would describe the same dream over and over. A huge building with towering columns, surrounded by trees and green gardens. And every single time, she said the same 4 words: "I want to go home." When her mother told her she was home, Dorothy would become frustrated, then depressed. Her parents would find her hiding under the dining room table, pouting. And when they asked what was wrong, it was always the same answer: "I want to go home." When they asked where home was, she couldn't say. She didn't know where it was. She only knew this wasn't it. Then it got stranger. Dorothy, a small English child in Edwardian London, would occasionally start speaking in a heavy foreign accent. An accent no one in her family had. An accent no one could place. It was so unsettling that her parents had trouble finding anyone willing to babysit her. Which is the only reason what happened next happened at all. When Dorothy was 4, her parents planned a day at the British Museum. No sitter would take the strange little girl, so they brought her along. And at first, she behaved exactly like any 4-year-old dragged through a museum. She moped. She dragged her feet. She was bored out of her mind until they reached the Egyptian exhibit. The moment Dorothy saw the Egyptian statues, she tore her hand out of her mother's grip and ran wildly through the halls. Her parents chased her and found her going from statue to statue, kissing their feet and yelling at the other visitors for wearing shoes in the presence of gods. A 4-year-old scolding grown adults for violating the temple etiquette of a religion that had been dead for over 1,000 years. Her mother was mortified, but then Dorothy suddenly stopped. She went completely silent. They found her frozen in front of a glass case, staring at the face of an Egyptian mummy. Her mother picked her up to leave, and Dorothy got upset. And then, in a voice her parents described as sounding like an old woman, this 4-year-old English girl said, "These are my people." It took her parents hours to drag her out of the building. From that day on, whenever the family had free time, they went back to the Egyptian exhibit. It was the only place on Earth where Dorothy seemed happy, the only place she felt at peace. Now, most children say strange things. Most children have imaginary worlds. But here's where Dorothy's case breaks the pattern. And it's a pattern worth knowing because it shows up in thousands of documented cases around the world. When children report memories of a previous life, those memories almost always begin around age 2 or 3 and fade completely by age 5. The window closes. The child forgets. Dorothy's window never closed. Her memories didn't fade as she got older. They got sharper. When she was 7, her father bought her a children's encyclopedia about ancient Egypt. Dorothy spent hours hunched over the hieroglyphics with a magnifying glass. Her mother asked what she was doing, and Dorothy gave an answer that should be impossible for a 7-year-old. She didn't say, "I'm trying to learn." She said, "I'm trying to remember." And then came the photograph. While flipping through a science magazine, Dorothy came across a picture of a temple built for the pharaoh Seti I, the father of Ramses the Great, in a place called Abydos. She stared at it, confused. She asked her mother where all the trees were. Where were the green gardens? Her mother looked at the photo of a ruin standing in bare desert and asked her daughter, "What is this place?" And Dorothy smiled the biggest smile of her entire life, pointed at the Temple of Seti in Abydos, and said, "Mama, this is my home." The columned building from her dreams, the one she'd been begging to return to since she was 3. It was real. It was standing in the Egyptian desert, and she had just found its address. But remember what she asked. Where are the gardens? The photo showed sand. Dead, empty sand. No archaeologist had ever found gardens at the Temple of Seti. Hold on to that detail, because decades later, that throwaway question from a 7-year-old would be put to the test with shovels. And it's only the first of 3 predictions this woman made about buried places no living person had ever seen. The second was a hidden tunnel. The third was a sealed chamber inside the most famous tomb on Earth, a chamber science wouldn't detect until 2015. All 3 are coming, but first, you need to know who she used to be. Because Dorothy was about to find out, and the answer arrived in the middle of the night, in her own hand, in a language she had never been taught to write. As a teenager, Dorothy practically lived at the British Museum. She spent so much time in the Egyptian galleries that she caught the attention of one of the most famous Egyptologists alive, Sir E.A. Wallace Budge, the museum's keeper of Egyptian antiquities. Budge took an interest in the strange, obsessed girl and began teaching her to read hieroglyphics. And what he discovered unsettled even him. She picked it up quickly. Not gifted student quickly, freakishly quickly. Almost like the language was already in her, and he was just reminding her of it. Her openness about all of this made her a target. One Sunday afternoon, a priest showed up at the Edie family's door to inform them that Dorothy was no longer welcome at Sunday school. She had refused to sing a hymn that spoke poorly of Egypt. And the final straw came when she argued with her Sunday school teacher that Christianity itself was based on the older religion of Egypt, In the 1920s, from a teenage girl, that was heresy. She was cast out. She didn't care. Then, around age 15, the visitations began. Almost every night, Dorothy would wake in the small hours to the voice of a man who called himself Hor-Ra. He asked her to write down everything he said. She would slip into a trance, neither asleep nor awake, and her hand would move across the page, scribbling line after line of hieroglyphics. When she woke, she had no memory of writing anything. And when she looked at the pages, the handwriting wasn't hers. This went on for a year, night after night, page after page, until she had 70 handwritten pages of ancient Egyptian script. And when she finally pieced together what the pages said, she was reading the story of her own previous life. Her name had been Bentrashite. She was born in Abydos, the same town as the temple in the photograph, during the reign of Seti I, more than 3,000 years ago. She came from nothing. Her father was a soldier. Her mother sold vegetables. When Bentrashite was 2 years old, her mother died, and her father, unable to raise a daughter alone, gave her to the temple of Kom el Sultan, where she would be raised to become a priestess. At 12 years old, she was given a choice: leave the temple and face the world alone, or take the vows of a consecrated virgin and stay. She took the vows. A few years later, she met the pharaoh himself, Seti I, and what happened between them was absolutely forbidden. They had an affair, and Bentrashit became pregnant with the pharaoh's child. A consecrated virgin, sworn to the goddess Isis, carrying the king's baby. When she confessed the affair to the high priest, he told her that her sin against Isis was so severe that she would stand trial and would likely be sentenced to death. A trial would mean testimony. Testimony would mean the pharaoh's name dragged into scandal. So, to protect Seti, Bentrashit never let it reach the courtroom. She took her own life. That was the story sitting in 70 pages of trance writing on a London teenager's desk. A priestess, a pharaoh, a pregnancy, a suicide to protect a king. And suddenly, every strange thing about Dorothy Eady's childhood snapped into place. The dreams of the columned building, the gardens, the old woman's voice saying, "These are my people." The desperate, lifelong ache of, "I want to go home." If you're the kind of person who needs to know how a story like this ends, and whether the evidence actually holds up, subscribe, because cases like this, one, are exactly what this channel digs into every week. Because here's the thing about Dorothy Eady. She didn't treat those 70 pages as the end of the mystery. She treated them as a set of instructions. If Bentrashite was real, then Abydos was home, and Dorothy was going to get there or die trying. Again, her way in came through work. In 1931, a position opened in London writing for an Egyptian public relations magazine, and Dorothy took it. This was a delicate era. Egypt had been declared officially independent from the United Kingdom in 1922. But Britain still had its hands deep in the country's affairs. Dorothy used her new platform to advocate loudly for Egyptian nationalism and full independence, an Englishwoman publicly fighting for Egypt against her own empire. Through the magazine, she began corresponding with a wealthy Egyptian man named Iman Abdal Meguid. In 1933, he proposed. She accepted, and Dorothy Eady finally boarded a ship to Egypt for the first time in her life. The first time in this life. When she stepped off the boat in Cairo, she dropped to her knees and kissed the ground. She wept, and she said the words she'd been saying since she was 3 years old. Except, now they were finally true. I'm home. The marriage didn't survive. Her husband's wealthy family was scandalized by how openly she talked about her past life, and by the uncomfortable fact that this foreign woman seemed more devoted to Egypt than they were. But before the divorce, she gave birth to a son, and she named him Seti. She named her child after the pharaoh from the hieroglyphic pages. Then she changed her own name in the ancient Egyptian style, where a woman was known through her child, to Seti, mother of Seti, the name the world would remember her by. In 1935, Seti was hired by Egypt's Department of Antiquities, the first woman they had ever hired. No degree, no formal training of any kind. And yet, within a few years, she was publishing essays and scholarly articles, translating hieroglyphic documents, and building a reputation as a genuine expert that trained academics came to rely on. The department had hired an eccentric. What they got was one of the sharpest minds in the field, running on a source of knowledge nobody could explain. But she wasn't there for a career. She was there for Abydos, and in 1952, after nearly 2 decades of waiting, a position finally opened in the town where Benthreshet had lived and died. Seti packed her things and went home. The locals thought she was insane, at least at first. She walked everywhere barefoot. She observed the ancient Egyptian religion, leaving offerings to gods no one had worshipped in 1,500 years. She spent her nights praying and sleeping inside the temples themselves, on stone floors that had been cut when the pyramids were already ancient. And in 1957, the new chief of the Department of Antiquities decided enough was enough. He admitted her understanding of ancient Egyptian culture was uncanny. But he did not believe for 1 second that she had lived in the temple of Seti 3,000 years ago. So he designed the test you heard at the beginning of this story. The temple, the darkness. 6 attempts to trap her. 6 failures. A building whose layout had never been published, navigated blind by a woman who had never been inside it. And that was only the beginning of what she knew. Remember, the 7-year-old asking where the gardens were. Seti never stopped insisting they existed. She described the temple gardens from her dreams, from Benthreshet's memories. Gardens that appeared in no excavation report because no one had ever found them. She told the archaeologists where to dig. They dug, and under the sand, exactly where she pointed, they found the remains of the gardens of the Temple of Seti. The trees and green spaces a 3-year-old in London had been dreaming about for half a century were real, and they were precisely where she said they'd be. Then she did it again. She told them that if they dug on the north side of the temple, in one specific spot, they would find a hidden tunnel. Nothing on any map suggested a tunnel. They dug anyway. The tunnel was there. She wasn't guessing. She was remembering. And the Department of Antiquities knew exactly how valuable that was. In 1964, she turned 60, the mandatory retirement age under Egyptian law. They refused to let her go. The first woman they ever hired became the woman they legally couldn't afford to lose, and she was granted special permission to keep working. Egyptologists admitted openly that they could not explain how she made discovery after discovery simply by remembering. But her biggest claim, the one that should have been impossible to verify, reached far beyond Abydos. In 1972, Seti stated that the lost tomb of Queen Nefertiti was hidden underneath the tomb of her stepson, Tutankhamun. Think about how reckless that sounds. King Tut's tomb was discovered in 1922. By 1972, it had been crawled over, photographed, measured, and studied for 50 years by the best archaeologists on the planet. There was no evidence of any hidden chamber. None. The claim was ignored. Then, in 2015, more than 3 decades after her death, researchers ran modern radar imaging through Tutankhamun's tomb. The scans showed evidence of a concealed chamber, right where she said it would be. And she made one more claim in the same spirit. She said there was a small library hidden underneath one of the paws of the Great Sphinx. For years, that was just another piece of Seti folklore. Then, scans of the Sphinx revealed a cavity beneath it, right in the zone she described. A woman with no equipment, no excavation permits, and no formal education kept pointing at empty sand and sealed stone, and the ground kept proving her right. Here's where it gets strange. Because Dorothy Eady is not an isolated case. She's the most extreme example of a phenomenon that has been documented thousands of times. And the other cases follow the same unsettling script. England, 1957. Two sisters, Joanna and Jacqueline Pollock, 11 and 6 years old, were killed when a car lost control and jumped the curb. A year later, their mother Florence gave birth to twin girls, Julian and Jennifer, identical twins. Except identical twins should have identical bodies, and these didn't. Jennifer was born with a birthmark on her waist that matched a birthmark Jacqueline had before she died. She also had a mark on her forehead matching the scar Jacqueline had carried. Around age 2, the twins began asking for toys that had belonged to their dead sisters, toys they had never seen. And they would panic at moving cars, screaming that the car was coming to get them. Then there's the American case. During the Battle of Iwo Jima, fighter pilot James Houston Jr. was shot down by the Japanese and died in his cockpit on March 3, 1945. Over 50 years later, a 2-year-old boy named James Leininger began having relentless nightmares about being a fighter pilot, crashing into the ocean and dying. Shown photographs, the toddler named the type of aircraft Houston flew. He named the aircraft carrier Houston served on. He named other men who served alongside him. 2 years old. Every detail was checked. Every detail was verified as true. And one more, maybe the most staggering of all. A 4-year-old boy in Oklahoma named Ryan Hammonds began pretending to direct movies and told his mother he used to be a man who lived in Hollywood. His parents were devout Christians. They did not believe in reincarnation, and they did not want this. But Ryan kept saying things like, "I used to be somebody else. I used to be big, and now I'm little, and I hate it." He cried when the Hollywood sign appeared on television, saying that was his home. He described meeting Rita Hayworth, vacations in Paris, working at an agency where people changed their names. Then, one day his mother brought home a book about old Hollywood, and Ryan pointed at a photograph and said, "That's George. We did a picture together, and that guy is me. They found me." The man in the photo was Marty Martin, a Hollywood agent. Who knew Rita Hayworth? Who vacationed in Paris? Who ran an agency where people changed their names? Ryan knew Marty had danced on Broadway. He knew how many sisters Marty had. How many children? He even said his old house was on a street with the word rock in it. Marty Martin lived on Roxbury Drive. In total, Marty's own family confirmed 55 separate facts that a 4-year-old got right about a dead man he had no way of knowing existed. Not similar details. Not lucky guesses. 55 verified facts. And in almost every one of these cases, the memories arrive around age 2 and vanish by age 5, like a door quietly closing. Dorothy Eady's door never closed. Hers swung wider every year for 70 years, and it produced discoveries that are now part of the official archaeological record. This isn't as fringe as it sounds either. Around 30% of Americans believe in reincarnation, including almost a quarter of American Christians. And for roughly 2 billion people across Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, and other Eastern traditions, reincarnation isn't a paranormal curiosity. It's the basic architecture of existence. Tibetan Buddhism has built an entire institution on it. The Dalai Lama is held to be the reincarnation of Pema Dorje, the first Dalai Lama, who died in 1474. When a Dalai Lama dies, senior monks launch an elaborate search for his next incarnation, consulting oracles, interpreting visions, reading signs, even monitoring the direction of the smoke from his cremation as a clue to where the rebirth will occur. The current Dalai Lama, born in 1935 and counted as the 14th incarnation, was found at age 2 after a senior monk saw his village and his house in a vision. The boy, then named Lamo Thondup, was tested the same way Om Seti would later be tested in that dark temple. He was presented with objects and asked to identify which ones had belonged to the previous Dalai Lama. He picked out the ritual drum, he picked out the walking stick, he passed. Now, does all of this prove that Dorothy Eady was a 3,000-year-old priestess reborn in a London townhouse? Probably not. And if we're being honest with this story, we have to sit with the other explanation, because it exists. and it's Sirius. Skeptics point out that while Seti identified tombs, tunnels, gardens, and hidden rooms with unnerving accuracy, she also got plenty of things wrong. Her hit rate was remarkable, not perfect. And there's a medical theory that accounts for a disturbing amount of her story. When 3-year-old Dorothy fell down those stairs and hit her head, she may have suffered a brain injury. Head injuries can cause something called foreign accent syndrome, a real, documented condition in which patients suddenly speak with an accent they've never learned. That would explain the strange voice that scared away the babysitters. The same injury, skeptics argue, could have triggered obsessive-compulsive disorder with ancient Egypt as the fixation. And a child who becomes pathologically obsessed with one subject at age 3 or 4, who spends every free hour for decades inside the British Museum, who is personally tutored in hieroglyphics by Wallace Budge himself, could plausibly become one of the most knowledgeable people alive on that subject through nothing but raw, compulsive immersion. We also know, as a matter of record, that Dorothy Eady was institutionalized multiple times for mental health issues. And there's a harder problem underneath all of it. Every story from her early life, the death certificate, the museum outburst, the trance writing, even the famous test in the Dark Temple, comes to us from Dorothy herself. There's no independent evidence those events happened the way she described. At some point, we are simply taking her word. But that explanation has a problem. Obsession explains knowledge. It does not explain the gardens. It does not explain the tunnel on the north side. It does not explain a 1972 claim about a hidden chamber in Tutankhamun's tomb being confirmed by radar in 2015, 34 years after she was buried. Even the famous Egyptologists of her era, men who were openly hostile to anything mystical, went on record saying her knowledge of ancient Egypt went beyond intuition. Their word was uncanny. They stopped short of saying reincarnation. They just couldn't offer anything better. And not one of them denies what she contributed. This supposed madwoman is remembered today by a nickname the field itself gave her, the patron saint of Egyptology. So we're left with two possibilities, and both of them should keep you up at night. Either a brain injury can turn a toddler into a scholar, so complete that she outpredicts the entire archaeological establishment, pointing through solid stone at chambers no instrument would detect for decades. Or memory is not what we think it is. It doesn't die with the brain that made it. It travels. And if that's true, it means our history is missing a chapter, because it means the ancient Egyptians, who spent their entire civilization preparing for the journey after death, who built the largest monuments on Earth as machines for the soul, weren't being superstitious. They were being practical. It means somewhere in the ground at Abydos, there may still be sealed rooms that only one person ever knew about. And she took the map with her. She always said Bent Reshite's story was recorded in the temple. Maybe her own is too. Seti lived out her final years in Abydos, walking distance from the Temple of Seti, the building she had called home since she was 3 years old and 6,000 kilometers away. She died in 1981, as close to the gardens as she could get. The temple is still standing. The chamber behind Tutankhamun's walls is still sealed. The cavity beneath the Sphinx has never been opened. And somewhere out there, right now, there may be a small child waking up in the night, describing a green garden in the desert, telling her confused parents the only thing she knows for certain. I want to go home. If stories like this are your thing, the next investigation is on your screen right now. Watch it before it watches you. And they encoded the entire discipline into a ceremony they performed, unchanged, for 3,000 years, always crediting it to a goddess of measurement standing at the king's side in the dark. That is not less impressive than the lost civilization fantasy. In some ways, it is more impressive, because it is real and it was done by people, and we can measure it. Which brings us back to the carving on the wall, the king and the goddess, the rope stretched between them, the stars overhead. When the Egyptians were asked, how their monuments came to be aligned with the heavens, that image was their answer. Not machines, not magic. A cord, a plumb line, a notched palm rib, and a sky they had learned to read like a book. They told us exactly how they did it, and they told us who they believed taught them. And for centuries, we filed it under mythology and walked past it. But the alignment is still there. The Great Pyramid still points north to within a fraction of a degree, holding that aim across 4,500 years, while empires rose and fell around it. The shafts still climb through the stone toward Orion and the pole. And the one question that will not close is the simplest one of all. Where did a civilization at the very start of its recorded history, with no clumsy first attempts and no visible learning curve, suddenly acquire the ability to survey the sky with that kind of precision? The method appears complete on day one, credited to a source they called divine. And it never gets better, because it was never anything but perfect. The rope is still stretched in the carving. The stars have moved on, and the goddess is still standing there in the dark, holding the cord, pointing at a sky we are only now learning to measure. If this opened a door for you, the next investigation is already waiting on screen. Go watch it now.